A Field in England is a 2013 historical drama directed by Ben Wheatley, from a screenplay by Amy Jump. It takes place in the mid-17th century British Civil War between the parliamentarians and the royalists. On the outskirts of a battle, several deserters band together: Whitehead, an alchemist's apprentice; Friend, a fool; Jacob, a disillusioned soldier; and Cutler, who will soon turn on them. They encounter O'Neill, a thief who Whitehead was tasked with locating. O'Neill stole documents from Whitehead's master. O'Neill enlists Cutler into his mission to find what he believes is treasure in the field. The others, under the influence of hallucinogenic mushrooms, assist in the efforts. After a series of mishaps, it appears as though everyone except for Whitehead is dead. When Whitehead returns to the battlefield, he finds that Friend and Jacob are seemingly alive and ready to join him. At a glance, the story appears very straightforward, and its confinement to only one location may appear to diminish its complexity and scope, but in reality, the movie is heavily layered, nearly drowning in its depths. Gathering a series of clues throughout the story, A Field in England is not a simple sequence of events about a group of strangers just outside of a battlefield. Its themes and philosophical ramifications of what happens stretch much farther than the enormous field and the cloud of war. Before diving into A Field of England itself, let's expand on the choice of deliberate limits in a narrative. A simple story with limited characters and locations can contrarily produce boundless ideas and concepts, provoking larger thought and meaning than a narrative with more resources and more choices due to locations and characters. One of Samuel Beckett's most famous plays is deliberately limited in its scope, at least on the surface. It mainly focuses on two characters, Vladimir and Estragon, who have known each other for a long time and have developed a rapport with one another. They occasionally meet other passers-by, but the core of the story is about two characters who never leave one location. One of Tom Stopper's most famous plays is similarly focused, in this case on two characters named Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. They muse about their lots in life and their grisly task. Few other characters get much to say. Both stories are wholly engaging and develop whole worlds in only one sparsely populated spot. But the stories are not vast and far-reaching in their philosophies in spite of the narrow focus, but rather because of it. By limiting our perception, the audience is simultaneously forced into a kind of tunnel vision.
Shall we go?
Yes. Let's go.
Without the cacophony of so many different voices, we are allowed to linger on what little is heard. Every line becomes important, every character significant, every action the whole of the universe. In Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, the two titular characters are playing a simple game of heads or tails, but because this is a stripped-down play of the mundane being the entirety of its world, it means something. It shows the randomness of our lives, how little control we have over what becomes of us, how few choices we have, and how little we really know. And from this, we can derive all-encompassing philosophy. Absurdism is the concept that whether or not there is meaning in the universe, human beings are too limited to uncover it because of the chaotic, seemingly random nature of everything we see. Too many variables, not enough control. Absurdism states that the efforts of humanity to find inherent meaning will always eventually fail, largely because of the sheer amount of information is too much for us to comprehend, and that because we know so little about the gigantic size of the universe makes certainty impossible. All this from two men flipping a coin. So it is with A Field in England. The film expressly wishes not to explain itself, respecting the intelligence of the audience to form ideas and speculation rather than wait for exposition. The director has said, quote, "I'm not a big fan of exposition. What we wanted to do was create this environment where you felt like you'd just been parachuted into the past, and the people around you are already involved in it. They don't talk about it, why would they? I find it frustrating in movies where everyone stops to explain stuff. I think that breaks the reality of the film and the experience." Unquote. And so, we shall try to uncover it ourselves as it was intended. One way of looking at A Field in England is not that the four men are deserters from war, but rather that they are casualties. Whitehead, Friend, Jacob, and Cutler perished in the English Civil War and have met up together in the afterlife.
And we shall forge an alliance at the alehouse I passed earlier. What say you?
Did someone mention ale?
Their location does not appear to be heaven or any great reward. Rather, it seems as if the men are in the process of being judged. They exist in a kind of purgatory, a Roman Catholic concept that has crept into this tale about 17th century Protestant England. Or perhaps this field is just a version of the gates to the afterlife. There are several clues that lead to this conclusion. The first is that Friend and Whitehead speculate on what they must have done to incur God's wrath to end up in such a place, this lonely field next to the screams and horrors of war. Although if Friend's words are taken literally, he is genuinely speaking about the fact that he and the others are being judged at this very moment.
Yeah, well, the only knowledge I have is that God controls my fate as he sees fit, and I try to draw consolation from that. Oh, though I would like to know which of my many faults he's punishing me for now. Oh.
My master says, whilst we live in fear of hell, we have it.
Second, the idea of base desires opposing religion is brought up in the film, suggesting that they are in the midst of a philosophical and ontological crisis. Third, Friend, twice thought dead, resurrects, leaving the others bewildered. Fourth, O'Neill says, "Open up and let the devil in." This creates two possibilities. In the beginning of the film, it is said that O'Neill has gone missing, and that was Whitehead's initial task, to find him. It's possible that O'Neill died sometime between the point that he stole the documents from Whitehead's master and the moment that the four deserters are introduced to us. O'Neill, a sinful man, has been damned. He is trying to bring the others over to his side, over to hell. The other possibility is that we are not seeing the real O'Neill at all. Instead, he is a manifestation of the devil. It is often said that the devil takes many shapes. When the phrase, "open up and let the devil in," is uttered, it may be literal. The devil may be trying to tempt our quartet into damnation. Cutler clearly takes O'Neill's bait and turns to his side, whereas the others eventually team up against him. At the end of the film, after O'Neill is defeated, Cutler is nowhere to be seen, but Friend and Jacob reappear after seemingly killed in the field. Third resurrection for Friend. Cutler is damned. Whitehead, Friend, and Jacob passed the devil's test and made it to heaven. When someone says that something has existential themes, what does that mean? Existential, loosely defined, simply means related to the nature of existence, which is both true and misleading. Almost any narrative could have some claim of being existential, even by accident. A common hero's journey story often begins with our young upstart wondering about his place in the universe, which is, in a sense, the core of existential thought. However, when someone usually refers to something as being an existentialist story, it's a reference to its depth in this area. The idea that this narrative may have something meaningful to say about life, about its meaning or lack thereof, about our place in the cosmos, and about our seeming inability to decipher all of this in an absurd, possibly meaningless universe. Is A Field in England an existentialist film? Well, that can be difficult to explain or prove, because existentialism is actually represented by several different philosophers from the 19th century, notably Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Existentialism cannot be codified into one singular framework like a religious canon, and so judging A Field in England as an existentialist picture can only be properly ascertained by viewing it through the lenses of each individual philosopher. Purely as a thought experiment, let's do just that. Nietzsche is commonly known to have written, "God is dead," but this is not always understood to be a condemnation of religion. Rather, it merely asserts that our ancient spiritual beliefs are no longer the sole source of our values, no longer the gold standard upon which we set our expectations and our judgments of one another. The danger of this, of course, is the rejection of all sense of value. O'Neill frequently rejects Whitehead's concepts of morality, tradition, and values. He is an individualist, but this has an added side effect of creating antisocial, damaging behavior for both himself and his compatriots. Nietzsche believed in an idealized individual who could invent his own values and create the terms under which they excel, the fabled Übermensch.
You are confused, sir. It is I who am capturing you, not the other way round.
Do not concern yourself with bravery and I, Whitehead. It is official. You are my prisoner.
In a sense, O'Neill is the manifestation of this, but without any glorious ideals. Nietzsche's words have often been used to mean something more sinister, a loss of egalitarian values, even eugenics, and A Field in England certainly gives an example of this with O'Neill. He sees himself as greater, and therefore has no compunction about drafting unwilling participants into his quest for wealth. Because of this stripped-down narrative with little to no backstory for the majority of our characters, we are forced to grapple with what little we know about them and what we are told about them on screen. What do we know about O'Neill? Virtually nothing except that he knew Whitehead and his master. So, with no origin story, we are left with only a blueprint of O'Neill through his behavior, and that behavior is that of superiority, a feeling he is naturally the better of the other characters. Nietzsche often referred to commoners pejoratively as the rabble, or the herd, and O'Neill, too, appears to feel this way.
I will not break my oath! Open up and let the devil in. Open up and let the devil in, my boy. Open up and let the devil in!
Of God and this time period, the director has said, quote, "The Puritans were trying to iron paganism and magic out of Catholicism, splitting up and melding ideas. There are two really important periods in British history where we actually made a difference to the world, the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution. And I think at that moment in England, anything could have happened. Everyone was starving, and they were basically killing God because they were killing the king, God's representative. They were writing their own rules." Unquote. Conversely, Kierkegaard was significantly more religiously devout than Nietzsche, believing that a high attainment in life was called being a knight of faith. While Nietzsche's Übermensch is free of God and creates his own values entirely, a knight of faith is someone who has placed complete faith in both God and himself. Some would call that a contradiction, but a simpler explanation is that Kierkegaard's knight of faith is someone who gracefully embraces life. Whitehead is devout, someone who Kierkegaard might respect on some level, but in the beginning of the story, Whitehead is anything but free, anything but graceful or someone who embraces his life. He is a coward and a deserter. By the end of the film, however, he becomes this knight of faith, someone who believes both in God and in himself. In addition to far-reaching philosophy about the very nature of existence and the will of an individual human being, A Field in England also focused on more specific topics. Notably, the film has clear anti-war sentiments. Some background and a short history lesson may be necessary. As said, the film takes place during the English Civil War of the mid-17th century between the Parliamentarians and the Royalists. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died, leaving her first cousin twice removed, then King James of Scotland, to the English throne. James was accustomed to a different working relationship between the king and his Scottish Parliament than he had with the English Parliament, which caused noticeable friction. James was succeeded by Charles I, who similarly had difficulties with the Parliament and eventually resulted in open war between those loyal to the Crown and those loyal to the Parliament. It resulted in what many historians would actually consider to be multiple conflicts, but is sometimes shorthanded to the English Civil War or the English Revolution. So what does all this mean for the film? For one, the choice of a civil war rather than a war between separate nations could have greater purpose, that being that war is inescapable, even within one's own borders. Consider this. The deserters, Whitehead, Friend, Jacob, and Cutler, flee from war in the beginning of the film. They are convinced to do this only through a vague promise of going to an alehouse for drinks and women. They meet up with O'Neill, a horrible man who, as the men note, dresses in fanciful clothing and immediately believes himself to have authority over the others. He is quick to anger and conducts himself with as much violence as the men would have seen on the battlefield had they stayed. He wishes to acquire wealth, this alleged buried treasure. In other words, he lives in great luxury while the other men follow his orders, getting killed for their troubles. War is inescapable because man's flaws and vices are inescapable as well. They are part of our inherent code. It's a piece of us, what makes us what we are.
Your privy parts are doomed, homunculus!
Come here. No, thank you.
So what about the hallucinogenic mushrooms? How does this all play into the rest of the film? Whitehead and his new companions come across wild mushrooms and use them to make their soup. Much of what follows throughout the rest of the film is coded in hallucinations, or at least possible hallucinations. We are seeing the film from the perspectives of 4 deserters and 1 madman. That means that when we see something odd that shouldn't be there, that doesn't immediately tell the audience which of the 5 men is having the apparent vision. If the film truly is meant to be existential, that is, questioning the reality that we see around us, the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms is a way of reinforcing this idea and this theme. If A Field in England is meant to make us question our reality, then showing a group of men high on mushrooms creates layers of questioning. First, we are watching men forced to question their reality due to being on something that gives themselves visions, and second, we, the audience, are forced to question what we are seeing as well, never being sure what is real in the narrative and what is a hallucination by one or more of the men. Of the mushrooms, the director has said, quote, "I guess we made that leap to magic mushrooms by reading about other stuff that had to do with cyclosilin that was going on at the time, like grinding it up and blowing it into each other's faces, which was pretty wild. People eating stuff, thinking they were possessed by the devil," unquote. One could argue that showing hallucinogenic mushrooms instantly removes the idea that these men are dead and walking through an afterlife. After all, ghosts don't take mushrooms, do not need food, and should not be affected by earthly goods. However, that argument assumes that there is never a connection between hallucinations and the spiritual world. Visions are common in the Abrahamic religions, for instance. In Genesis, Jacob dreamed of a ladder or staircase reaching to heaven. In this dream, Jacob received God's promise that Abraham's blessing would be carried on through him. The book of Daniel contains many visions for its titular character, and nearly the entire revelation of John is a vision. These are only a few examples. In fact, many hallucinogenic plants have been used in spiritual rituals. A hallucinogenic morning glory was used by the Aztecs, typically ingesting their seeds for the effect. Peyote has traditionally been used in ceremony by Native American tribes of the southern plain states of Oklahoma and Texas. And as for the mushrooms of a field in England, Central and South American cultures actually built temples to mushroom gods and carved mushroom stones, which date back to as early as 1000 BC. The point is that the use of hallucinogens in the film does not instantly explain that everything is all a drug-induced vision. Historically, hallucinogens have a religious connection, and with the film's frequent talk of God and judgment, their inclusion in the film may have just as much to do with the mystical as it does with the physical. The director has gone on record saying he and the screenwriter did a great deal of research into magical and alchemic practices around the time of the English Civil War. The field with magical powers surrounded by a ring of mushrooms actually comes from a belief during that time period that when one enters the ring of mushrooms, time passes differently inside it, and that the laws of nature no longer apply. All that and O'Neill's scrying mirror are examples of mythology from that period.
What's what? An occult tool, a means for telling the past, present, perhaps even the future. He must have utilized some diabolical method to conceal his presence in the field. That is why he was not visible.
But this is not the spiritualism that most permeates the film. That would be the aforementioned Land of the Dead theory. It fits most closely with what we witness in the picture, a desolate land of judgment that no man can escape. Though one could argue that none of this is the most accurate interpretation of the film, because A Field in England is about loss of reality, loss of perception. It is the guessing that is important, not the solution. Thanks for watching.